Pack up your low-class drama and get out of my lobby before I have security throw you onto the pavement." The words were spat with venom that silenced the gilded lobby of the Newman Grand. Charles Ramos didn't just dismiss the woman before him. He sought to erase her. With a sneer that twisted his features, his open palm cracked across Dr. Grace Newman's cheek, the sound echoing like a gunshot against Italian marble. Grace didn't stumble. She didn't cry out. She simply stood in a crystalline, terrifying stillness, the heat on her face a sharp contrast to the ice in her veins. Charles adjusted his cufflinks, radiating the smell of expensive bourbon and unearned confidence, entirely unaware that he had just assaulted the one woman whose signature governed his bank account. Hello, amazing people. Welcome back to Echoverse, the home where forgotten voices finds their echo. Before we reveal the 9-minute countdown to his ruin, let us know where you are watching from and subscribe so you never miss an exciting story like this. The morning sun hit the gold-leafed inn on the hotel facade as Grace stepped from a modest taxi. Dressed in a sharp charcoal suit with her hair pulled into a low, professional bun, she looked like any other high-end consultant. She carried a single leather briefcase, not just for luggage, but to hold the evidence she knew she'd find. As she crossed the lobby, she watched the staff's eyes slide right past her to fawn over a group of socialites. This was her crown jewel. But today, she was a ghost in her own house, here to see exactly what happened when the queen wasn't looking. Grace's heels clicked a steady rhythm across the polished marble as she approached the front desk, each step a silent count in her private audit. The lobby stretched before her like a cathedral to wealth. Crystal chandeliers refracting morning light into 1,000 diamonds, velvet chairs arranged in conversational clusters that whisper exclusivity, Art Deco fixtures gleaming with the kind of polish that cost more per hour than most people earned in a day. This was her vision made manifest, the flagship that had launched an empire. Yet as she moved through the space, she felt like an intruder in her own masterpiece. A black couple in their 60s, dressed in elegant travel wear, stood near the brass luggage cart. The doorman, Marcus, according to his nameplate, though Grace didn't recognize him from the personnel files, walked past them 3 times, his eyes skating over them as if they were part of the furniture. When a blonde woman in athleisure stepped from a rideshare, Marcus materialized at her elbow with a warm smile, reaching for bags she hadn't even set down yet. Grace's jaw tightened, but she kept her expression neutral, clinical. Observe. Document. Don't react. Not yet. At the front desk, a young clerk named Jennifer was laughing with a guest about restaurant recommendations, her enthusiasm genuine and bright. Grace queued behind a Hispanic family with 2 children, watching as Jennifer's smile flickered and died the moment she looked up and saw them. The transformation was surgical, warmth replaced by a professional mask that somehow managed to communicate both efficiency and dismissal. Checking in, Jennifer's tone was flat, her fingers already moving to pull up the reservation before the father could even nod. No welcome to the Newman Grand. No eye contact with the excited children clutching their stuffed animals. Just transaction. Just processing. Grace glanced at the gold-framed mission statement hanging behind the desk, the words she'd written herself a decade ago. Every guest. Every time. Without exception. The irony tasted like copper in her mouth. When Jennifer finally turned to her, Grace saw the same cool assessment, the same unconscious calculation. Grace was well-dressed, yes, but her taxi arrival had been noted. Her lack of visible designer logos had been cataloged. She was too brown to be immediately deferred to, too polished to be immediately dismissed. Jennifer landed on cautious neutrality. Welcome to the Newman Grand. Checking in, Grace allowed a small smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. Actually, I'm already checked in. Room 412. But I believe there's an issue with my billing I need to discuss. Jennifer's fingers flew across the keyboard, her expression shifting to something Grace recognized with grim satisfaction. The look of someone who just found a reason to exert power over someone they'd already decided didn't quite belong. I see. Let me get the manager. He'll want to handle this personally. Grace set her briefcase on the counter with deliberate care. I'm sure he will. Charles Ramos emerged from the back office like a man who'd never questioned his right to occupy space. He was tall, immaculately groomed, with the kind of tan that came from country club golf courses and the kind of watch that announced generational wealth. His suit was bespoke, his stride confident, and his smile, aimed not at Grace but at Jennifer, was conspiratorial. He didn't even glance at Grace until he was directly in front of her, and when he did, his expression shifted to something Grace had seen 1,000 times before, the look of a man deciding how much courtesy she'd earned. I understand there's a billing concern. His tone was pleasant enough, but Grace caught the edge beneath it. This wasn't an offer to help. This was a challenge. Grace pulled up her phone, displaying the Newman Grand app with clinical precision. I was charged twice for my room, once at check-in yesterday, and again this morning. I'd like the duplicate charge removed and a confirmation email sent to my account. Charles leaned forward, barely glancing at the screen, before straightening with a dismissive shake of his head. That's not a duplicate charge. That's security hold and your nightly rate. Standard practice. If you'd read the terms and conditions when you booked. I'm familiar with the terms and conditions, Grace interrupted, her voice level but firm. I'm also familiar with your booking system. This is a duplicate charge for the same night. I'd like it corrected. The lobby had begun to fill with the morning crowd. Business people collecting coffee from the concierge desk, tourists consulting maps, staff members moving between stations. Grace was acutely aware of the audience forming, of phones already half raised in that modern reflex to document conflict. Charles seemed to sense it too, and rather than de-escalating, he leaned into the performance. Ma'am, I don't know what kind of establishment you're used to staying at, but here at the Newman Grand, we don't tolerate guests making false accusations against our billing practices. His voice had risen just enough to carry, to pull attention their way. If you don't understand how luxury hotels operate, perhaps you'd be more comfortable at a property more suited to your budget. Grace felt the heat rising in her chest, but her expression remained glacial. She'd built an empire by never letting them see her flinch, never giving them the satisfaction of a reaction. I'd like to speak to your supervisor. Charles's laugh was short and sharp, designed to humiliate. I am the supervisor, sweetheart. I'm the general manager of this property, and I'm telling you that if you continue to disrupt my lobby and harass my staff with your little tantrum, you'll be checking out a lot sooner than you planned. Then I'd like your corporate contact information. Grace said, each word precisely measured. I'm sure your superiors at Newman Hospitality Group would be interested in how you handle guest concerns. Something flickered across Charles's face, not quite fear, but close. Annoyance, perhaps. The entitlement of a man unaccustomed to being challenged. He stepped closer, invading her space in a way that made several nearby guests glance over with visible discomfort. Let me make this very clear. You can take your complaint, your attitude, and your cheap luggage. Excuse me? Grace's voice dropped to something dangerous. And you can pack up your low-class drama and get out of my lobby before I have security throw you onto the pavement. The venom in his voice was palpable now, his mask slipping to reveal the rot beneath. He jabbed a finger toward her face, close enough that she could smell the bourbon on his breath. Expensive and sour. People like you come in here thinking you can bully your way into discounts, trying to game the system, making scenes. People like me. Charles's sneer twisted into something uglier. Don't play that card with me. I know exactly what you're doing, and it's not going to work. Grace took a single step back, not in retreat, but to create the space that would make what came next undeniable. Mr. Ramos, I'm going to ask you one more time to correct the billing error and provide me with corporate contact information. And I'm going to tell you one more time. His hand came up, fingers still extended, aggressive and dismissive. But somewhere in the heat of his rage, in the certainty of his power, the gesture transformed. His open palm swung wide and cracked across Grace's cheek with a sound that shattered the lobby's carefully curated ambience. For a heartbeat, the Newman Grand went absolutely silent. Grace stood motionless, her head turned slightly from the impact, her cheek blooming red. She didn't raise a hand to her face, didn't gasp, didn't speak. She simply turned her head back to face Charles with a slowness that was more terrifying than any scream could have been. Charles adjusted his cufflinks, his breathing heavy, his face flushed with self-righteous anger. Now get out before I call the police. Grace reached into her briefcase with movements so calm they seemed choreographed. You won't need to call them, she said quietly. They'll be here soon enough. Grace withdrew her phone from her briefcase with the precision of a surgeon selecting a scalpel. Her fingers moved across the screen with practiced efficiency, pulling up not a complaint form, not a customer service hotline, but a direct line that bypassed every layer of corporate bureaucracy. The phone rang once before a voice answered, crisp and immediate. Dr. Newman, we weren't expecting your call until this afternoon. Grace didn't take her eyes off Charles, whose expression had begun to shift from righteous anger to something more uncertain. Linda, I need you to conference in security, HR, and legal. Immediately. I'm putting you on speaker. She tapped the screen and set the phone on the marble counter between them. The lobby had gone from silent to suffocating, the kind of quiet that precedes an earthquake. Staff members had frozen mid-task. Guests had their phones raised, recording, their expressions ranging from shock to eager anticipation of the drama unfolding before them. This is Linda O'Casick, Chief Operating Officer of Newman Hospitality Group. Security and legal are on the line. HR is joining now. The voice emanated from a phone with corporate authority that made Jennifer visibly pale. Charles's jaw tightened, but his voice maintained its condescending edge. I don't know what kind of intimidation tactic you think this is. My name is Dr. Grace Newman, Grace said, her voice carrying across the lobby with a kind of power that didn't require volume. I am the founder and CEO of Newman Hospitality Group. This property, the Newman Grand, is my flagship hotel. And in the last 10 minutes, I have been racially profiled, verbally abused, and physically assaulted by your general manager, Charles Ramos, in my own lobby. The words landed like grenades. Charles's face drained of color. Jennifer made a small, choked sound. A concierge in the background actually dropped the tablet she'd been holding. That's not, Charles stammered, his carefully constructed authority crumbling like wet sand. This is a misunderstanding. I didn't know. You didn't know who I was, Grace finished, her tone arctic. But that shouldn't have mattered, should it, Mr. Ramos? Every guest deserves respect. Every guest deserves dignity. Those are the values I built this company on. Values you just violated in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. She checked her watch, a simple gesture that somehow carried the weight of an executioner's axe. Linda, timestamp this call. 9 minutes. That's how long Mr. Ramos has left as an employee of this organization. Documented. Linda's voice confirmed through the speaker. Grace's gaze swept the lobby, cataloging every face, every frozen staff member, every witness to her humiliation. Jennifer Halstead, front desk clerk. You observed your manager's behavior and said nothing. You're terminated, effective immediately. Jennifer's hand flew to her mouth, tears already forming. Marcus Chun, doorman. I watched you ignore guests of color while fawning over white guests for the past 30 minutes. You're terminated. Marcus took a step backward, his face ashen. Charles Ramos. Grace's attention returned to the man who'd struck her, and something in her expression made him flinch. You are terminated for assault, discrimination, and conduct unbecoming of a Newman Hospitality Group employee. Security is being dispatched to escort you from the premises. If you attempt to access this building again, you'll be arrested for trespassing. You can't do this, Charles said, but his voice had lost all its venom, replaced by something desperate and small. My family has connections to this company. My uncle sits on your board. This won't stand. Grace tilted her head, almost curious. Then I suggest you call your uncle. I'm sure he'll be very interested to hear why I'm about to shut down this entire property for an emergency audit. She raised her voice, addressing the remaining staff scattered throughout the lobby. All on-duty staff are to report to the conference room immediately. Anyone who fails to report will be terminated for insubordination. You have 3 minutes. The lobby erupted into motion, staff members abandoning their posts, guests whispering and filming, and somewhere in the distance, the wail of approaching sirens. Grace picked up her phone, ending the speaker call but keeping Linda on the line. Send the crisis management team. And Linda, Bring Hattie Morrison's file. I think it's time we had a conversation with someone who's actually been paying attention. The video hit social media at 6:47 p.m., precisely 8 hours after Charles Ramos had been escorted from a Newman Grand in handcuffs. Grace was in her executive office reviewing termination paperwork when her phone began to vibrate with the kind of persistent urgency that signaled catastrophe. The first notification was from her publicist, the second from her attorney. By the third, she'd already pulled up the trending hashtag #Unhingio. The footage was damning in its surgical precision. It showed Grace, stone-faced and cold, standing over a cowering Charles Ramos. His hands were raised offensively, his expression one of genuine fear. Her voice, sharp and imperious, cut through the lobby. "You're terminated." The camera angle made her look towering, menacing. It made Charles look small, victimized. And most crucially, it began exactly 3 seconds after he'd struck her, erasing the assault entirely from the narrative. The caption read, "Blaxio goes nuclear on manager over billing dispute. Fires entire staff in racially motivated rampage." Within an hour, it had 2 million views. Within 3, it had been picked up by every major news outlet with an appetite for controversy. Grace watched the video loop on her laptop screen, each repetition a twist of the knife. The comments section was a cesspool of exactly what she'd expected. Accusations of playing the race card, of abusing her power, of being an angry black woman on a vendetta. Never mind that she'd been assaulted. Never mind that she'd witnessed systematic discrimination in her own establishment. The narrative had been weaponized, and she was now the villain. Her office phone rang. Not her cell, not her direct line, but the landline that only board members had access to. Grace stared at it for 3 rings before answering. "Grace." Walter Hartwick's voice was warm honey over arsenic. "I'm sure you've seen the situation developing online." "The doctored video, you mean?" Grace kept her voice steady, professional. "The one that conveniently omits the part where Charles Ramos physically assaulted me in front of 40 witnesses." "Yes, well." Walter's pause was calculated, the verbal equivalent of a disappointed sigh. Perception is reality in these situations, and the perception right now is quite damaging. The board has been fielding calls all evening. Shareholders are concerned. Several major clients have already reached out asking if this reflects our company culture. Grace's hand tightened on the phone. "Our company culture of not tolerating racism and assault? I would hope that's exactly what it reflects." "Don't be obtuse, Grace. You know what I mean." Walter's tone sharpened, the pretense of concern falling away. "You shut down our flagship property without consulting the board. You terminated a dozen employees without following proper protocols. You put a man with deep family connections to this company in handcuffs based on allegations." "Based on assault," Grace interrupted, ice flooding her veins. "Which was witnessed, filmed, and documented. Charles Ramos struck me across the face. Walter, are you really suggesting I should have handled that with performance review? I'm suggesting that you let your emotions override your judgment. And now the board is in a very difficult position." Walter's voice dropped to something almost sympathetic, which made it infinitely more dangerous. "We need you to take a step back, Grace. Just temporarily. A leave of absence while we conduct an independent investigation into the incident and your handling of it." The words landed with surgical precision. A leave of absence. The first step toward permanent removal, dressed up in the language of care and due process. "You're asking me to step aside from the company I built because I refuse to accept being assaulted in my own hotel." Grace's voice was dangerously quiet. "I'm asking you to consider what's best for Newman Hospitality Group," Walter replied. "The Ramos family is prepared to pursue legal action. They have resources, Grace, media connections. And right now, the story they're telling is resonating with people. We need time to manage this crisis. And we can't do that if you're making unilateral decisions based on personal grievances." Grace ended the call without another word. She sat in the gathering darkness of her office, the city lights of the skyline glittering below like false promises. The empire she'd built was turning against her, brick by brick. Her phone buzzed again. A text from an unknown number. Dr. Newman, this is Hattie Morrison from housekeeping. I think we need to talk. I have something you need to see. Grace arrived at the address Hattie had texted. A modest duplex in a neighborhood that had somehow resisted gentrification, where porches still had wind chimes and neighbors actually knew each other's names. It was nearly midnight, but the porch light was on, and through the window Grace could see a silhouette waiting. The door opened before she could knock. Hattie Morrison was smaller than Grace had imagined, barely 5 feet tall, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that held the kind of wisdom that came from watching people when they thought no one was looking. She wore a cardigan over floral pajamas and held a steaming mug that smelled like chamomile and honey. Dr. Newman. Hattie's voice was soft but steady. Thank you for coming. I know you've had a day. Grace managed a tired smile. That's one way to put it. Hattie led her through a living room that was a shrine to a long career. Framed certificates of service. Photos of Hattie with what must have been decades of hotel staff. A small shelf displaying Employee of the Month plaques. But it was a dining room table that made Grace stop in her tracks. Composition notebooks. Dozens of them, stacked in neat chronological towers. Each spine labeled with dates spanning 3 decades. Next to them sat manila folders bulging with printed emails, photographs, and what looked like copies of internal memos. 32 years. Hattie said quietly, moving to stand beside the table like a curator presenting her life's work. I started at the Newman Grand when it first opened. Watched it grow from your father's dream into your empire. And I watched something else grow too. Something uglier. Grace approached the table as if it might detonate. Her fingers traced the spine of the nearest notebook. 1993 to 1995. Hattie, what is this? Insurance, Hattie said simply. She pulled out a notebook from 2018 and opened it to a page marked with a yellow sticky note. March 14th, 2018. Charles Ramos, 2 months into his position as assistant manager, told the housekeeping staff that we needed to pay special attention to rooms occupied by Black and Latino guests because they were more likely to steal or cause damage. He said it in the staff meeting. 12 witnesses. I wrote down every word. Grace's breath caught. She took the notebook, reading Hattie's careful handwriting, the precise quotations, the names of everyone present. Hattie pulled another notebook, then another, laying them open like evidence at a trial. June 2019. Charles instructed front desk staff to accidentally overbook the hotel during major conventions that attracted predominantly Black attendees. Said it would maintain the property standards. September 2020. He implemented a policy requiring additional security deposits from guests with urban-sounding names. His words, not mine. January 2022. He told a housekeeper she should be grateful to work somewhere this nice instead of cleaning houses in the ghetto where people like her belonged. Each revelation was a hammer blow. Grace sank into one of Hattie's dining chairs, surrounded by the documented evidence of institutional rot that had festered beneath her carefully constructed empire. Why didn't you come to me? Grace's voice was barely above a whisper. Why didn't you report this to corporate HR, to legal, to... I did. Hattie's interruption was gentle but firm. She pulled out a manila folder, this one thicker than the others. 17 formal complaints over 8 years. Every single one filed with HR. Every single one marked, investigated, and resolved. But nothing ever changed. Charles stayed. His policies stayed. And the housekeepers who complained the loudest. She paused, her eyes meeting Grace's with devastating clarity. They didn't stay. Grace opened the folder. Complaint forms on Newman Hospitality letterhead. Each one stamped with official-looking responses signed by HR Director Margaret Chin. Investigated. No evidence of misconduct found. Matter closed. The signatures were authentic. The investigations were theater. Margaret Chin reports directly to board. Grace said slowly, the pieces clicking into place with sickening precision. Walter appointed her. Hattie nodded. The Ramos family has had board seats since your father brought them in as investors in 2003. Charles isn't just protected, Dr. Newman. He's connected to the very people who are supposed to hold him accountable. Grace looked at the notebooks, the folders, the 3 decades of careful documentation that Hattie had maintained like an archivist preserving evidence for a trial she hoped would someday come. Why keep all of this if you knew nothing would happen? Hattie's smile was sad but determined. Because I knew someday someone would need the truth, and I hoped that someone would have the power to do something about it. She placed her hand on Grace's shoulder. You built something beautiful, Dr. Newman, but beautiful things can rot from the inside if no one's watching. I've been watching, and now you know what I've seen. Grace spent the next 48 hours transforming her home office into a war room. Hattie's notebooks lined one wall, their spines creating a timeline of systemic abuse. On her laptop, she begun cross-referencing the complaints with financial records, board meeting minutes, and corporate communications she'd requisitioned from legal. What emerged was a pattern that made her earlier discoveries look like mere symptoms of a far more metastatic disease. The first anomaly appeared in the quarterly reports from 2019. The Newman Grand, despite being the flagship property, had begun showing declining profit margins, not catastrophic, but consistent enough to raise concerns among shareholders. Grace had attributed it to market fluctuations, increased competition, the normal ebb and flow of the hospitality industry. But now, looking at the numbers alongside Hattie's documentation of Charles's policies, she saw something else entirely. Every discriminatory policy Charles had implemented had a financial consequence. The accidental overbooking during black conventions meant lost revenue and legal settlements. The excessive security deposits meant canceled reservations and negative reviews. The high turnover among housekeeping staff, who kept complaining and kept getting pushed out, meant constant recruitment and training costs. Charles wasn't just a racist. He was systematically tanking the property's value. The question was, why would the board allow it? Grace pulled up the shareholder registry, something she rarely examined since she maintained majority control through her founder's shares. The Ramos family held 12%, significant but not controlling. Walter Hartwick's investment firm held 8%. Then there were the smaller shareholders, the investors her father had brought in during the early expansion years. She was about to close the file when something caught her eye. A shell company called Meridian Capital Holdings had been quietly purchasing shares over the past 18 months. Small acquisitions, none large enough to trigger SEC reporting requirements, but collectively adding up to nearly 15% ownership. Grace ran a corporate registry search on Meridian. The ownership structure was deliberately opaque, routed through 3 layers of holding companies. But she'd built a hospitality empire by being relentless, and relentless didn't stop at the first locked door. 2 hours and several calls to her corporate attorney later, she had a name. The majority stakeholder in Meridian Capital was Victor Ramos, Charles's uncle and a senior partner at the hedge fund Silvercrest Investments. Her phone rang. It was James Chun, her CFO, and one of the few board members she still trusted. Grace, we need to talk. Not on this line. Can you meet me? 20 minutes later, they sat in a 24-hour diner 3 miles from corporate headquarters, the kind of anonymous place where business deals when to die or be born. James looked like he hadn't slept, his tie loosened, his usual composure fractured. There's a vote, he said without preamble. Emergency board meeting scheduled for Friday. Walter's calling it. The agenda is your removal as CEO, citing the Newman Grand incident as evidence of emotional instability and judgment concerns that pose a fiduciary risk to shareholders. Grace had expected this, but hearing it confirmed still felt like a punch to the sternum. Let them vote. I have majority control. James shook his head, his expression grim. That's what I thought too, but I did some digging after Walter made his play. Grace, someone's been buying up your father's original investor shares through proxies, combined with the Ramos family holdings and Meridian Capital, which I'm betting you've already discovered is Victor Ramos. They're within striking distance of forcing you out. That's not possible. Those shares are locked with right of first refusal clauses. They can't be sold without offering them to me first. Unless the board waives that requirement with a supermajority vote, which Walter convened 3 weeks ago, citing operational efficiency concerns. It's buried in the minutes you were too busy running the company to scrutinize. The diner's fluorescent lights suddenly felt too bright, the coffee in front of her too bitter. Grace's mind raced through the implications. They'd been planning this for months. The video, the smear campaign, that wasn't reactive. That was the execution phase. James nodded. I think Charles was a trigger man, but not the architect. Someone wanted you to react exactly the way you did, swiftly, decisively, and in a way that could be framed as unhinged. They needed you to give them ammunition. And once I'm removed? Grace asked, though she already knew the answer. Silvercrest Investments has been circling Newman Hospitality for 2 years. They specialize in acquiring underperforming hospitality assets, stripping them for parts, and selling the real estate to developers. The Newman Grand alone sits on property worth $300 million. Once you're out and the board's composed of their people, they'll have the votes to prove the sale. Grace stared at her reflection in the diner window, exhausted, furious, and cornered by the very people she trusted to help her build something lasting. Her father had brought the Ramos family in as partners, believing in old-world notions of loyalty and handshake deals. He'd never imagined they'd wait for him to die, wait for his daughter to build his dream into an empire, and then systematically dismantle it for profit. How long do I have? She asked. The vote's in 3 days. But Grace, even with evidence of Charles's misconduct, even with Hattie's documentation, they'll say you're deflecting, trying to justify your behavior. You need something that ties the board directly to this conspiracy, something that proves they knew about the discrimination and allowed it because it served their endgame. Grace thought of the notebooks, the complaint stamped, resolved, the HR director who reported to Walter. She thought of the doctored video, the precisely timed media campaign, the coordination required to execute this kind of takedown. Then I guess, she said quietly, we'd better find it. The knock on Grace's apartment door came at 2:37 a.m. 3 soft taps, followed by a pause, then 2 more. Grace had been awake anyway, surrounded by printouts and laptop screens, her eyes burning from hours of tracing shell companies and offshore accounts. She checked the security camera feed on her phone and saw a young man in a hoodie, his face partially obscured, shifting his weight nervously on her doorstep. Every instinct screamed not to open the door, but something about the way he stood, hunched, like he was carrying something heavy that wasn't physical, made her override her caution. She grabbed her phone, kept 911 ready on the screen, and opened the door with the chain still engaged. Dr. Newman? His voice cracked slightly, young and uncertain. My name is Marcus Obi. I worked in IT at the Newman Grand. I need to talk to you. Please. Grace studied him through the gap. Early 20s, dark circles under his eyes, hands trembling slightly as they clutched a laptop bag. He looked terrified, but not dangerous. She made a decision that was either brilliant or catastrophically stupid and opened the door. Marcus practically fell into her apartment, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to materialize from the hallway shadows. Grace closed and locked the door, then faced him with her arms crossed, her phone still in hand. You have 2 minutes to tell me why you're here before I call security. Marcus set his laptop bag on her coffee table with the careful precision of someone handling explosives. I'm the one who edited the video, the one that went viral. Mr. Ramos, Charles. He told me it was for insurance purposes, that you'd gone crazy and assaulted him, and we needed to protect the hotel from litigation. He said you were trying to destroy the company your father built, and that we had to document your behavior. Grace felt ice settle in her stomach. And you believed him. I'm 23 years old, Dr. Newman. I've been working at the hotel for 6 months. When the general manager tells you something, He stopped, swallowed hard. I believe him because I didn't have any reason not to, until I saw what happened after. He opened his laptop, hands shaking so badly he had to try twice to get the password right. I couldn't sleep. Kept thinking about how the video felt wrong, how the timing was too perfect, how Charles knew exactly where the cameras were when he hit you. So I went back and pulled the raw footage from the security server. All of it, from every angle. Marcus turned the laptop toward Grace, and she saw the Newman Grand lobby from a different perspective. The camera positioned above the concierge desk, showing the entire front desk area in wide angle. The timestamp read 10:47 a.m., 3 minutes before Charles had struck her. This is what I didn't include. Marcus said quietly, pressing play. Grace watched herself approach the front desk, watched the subtle dismissals from staff, watched Charles emerge with that predatory confidence. But this angle caught something the viral video had erased. The moments before the slap, Charles invading her space, his finger jabbing toward her face, his body language aggressive and threatening. The audio was clearer, too, catching every word of his escalating verbal assault, every racist dog whistle, every threat. And then the slap, captured in its full, undeniable violence. But Marcus didn't stop the video there. He let it play through Grace's termination announcement, and then he jumped forward 15 minutes to footage Grace had never seen. Charles in security office, watching the playback with a man Grace recognized as Victor Ramos, his uncle, the Silvercrest investor. They were reviewing the angles, discussing which camera had the best shot, which timestamps to use. Send it to the family's media contact. Victor said on the recording, his voice crisp with command. Make sure it starts after he hits her. We need her looking like the aggressor. This is our window. Charles nodded. And then, this was the part that made Grace's blood run cold. He smiled. She made this almost too easy. All that talk about dignity and respect. And the moment someone pushes back, she shows exactly who she really is. Emotional. Reactionary. Everything the board's been saying about her. The board's been saying what we've told them to say. Victor corrected. But yes, this gives us what we need. By Monday, she'll be so toxic the shareholders will beg us to remove her. Marcus stopped the video. In the silence that followed, Grace could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of what she just witnessed settling into her bones like lead. There's more, Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. I pulled the email metadata. Charles sent the edited video to a media consulting firm called Whitmore and Associates. They're the ones who seeded it to social media and news outlets. I looked them up. Whitmore is retained by Silvercrest Investments for crisis management and reputation control. Grace sat down slowly on her couch, her mind racing through the implications. This wasn't just about removing her from the CEO position. This was a coordinated conspiracy, planned and executed with corporate precision, using her own trauma as the weapon to destroy her. Why are you bringing this to me? She asked finally. You could lose everything. Your job, your career, they'll come after you. Marcus's jaw tightened with something that looked like resolve. Because I helped them make you a villain for refusing to accept being assaulted in your own building. Because when I went home and told my mom what happened, she asked me one question. If that was your sister in that lobby, would you have edited that video? And I realized, his voice cracked. I realized I'd become exactly the kind of person who enables monsters because it's easier than standing up to them. Grace looked at this young man who'd risked everything to bring her the truth and felt something shift in her chest. She'd spent so long being the untouchable CEO, the woman with the professional mask who never showed weakness, that she'd forgotten what it meant to simply be human with someone. Thank you, Marcus, she said, and meant it more than any corporate platitude she'd ever delivered. Can you send me everything? All the raw footage, the metadata, the email trails. He nodded, already pulling out a USB drive. It's all here, encrypted. Password is your father's birthday. It was in his obituary, so I figured you'd know it. As Marcus left her apartment, disappearing back into the pre-dawn darkness, Grace sat with the drive in her hand and allowed herself one moment of something she'd been denying herself for days. Hope. They'd made a mistake. They'd documented their own conspiracy. And in 72 hours, she was going to make them pay for every single second of it. The boardroom of Newman Hospitality Group occupied the entire 42nd floor of a glass tower that Grace's father had commissioned 30 years ago. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the city. He conquered one property at a time, building an empire from a single roadside motel and a dream that his daughter had transformed into a billion-dollar enterprise. Grace had always loved this room, the massive mahogany table, the leather chairs, the wall of framed photographs documenting every hotel opening, every milestone, every triumph. Today, It felt like a mausoleum. The board members filed in with the solemn procession of pallbearers. Walter Hartwood took his seat at the head of the table opposite Grace, his expression carefully arranged into something resembling regret. Victor Ramos sat 3 seats down, his presence a violation Grace had to tolerate under corporate bylaws. Margaret Chun from HR was there, along with the company's general counsel, Robert Park, and 6 other board members whose loyalty Grace was about to test. "I want to thank everyone for making time on such short notice," Walter began, his voice carrying a measured tone of a man who'd rehearsed this moment. "We're here to address a matter of grave concern regarding Dr. Newman's fitness to continue as CEO of this organization." Grace sat perfectly still, her hands folded on the table in front of her expression unreadable. She dressed in a charcoal suit, armor, really, and wore her father's watch, the one he'd been wearing the day he'd signed the papers to open the Newman Grand. For luck, for strength, for remembering what this fight was really about, Walter slid a document across the table toward her. "This is a resolution calling for your immediate resignation, citing conduct unbecoming of a CEO and actions that have caused irreparable harm to the company's reputation and financial standing. The viral incident at the Newman Grand, your reckless termination of staff without due process, and the resulting media firestorm have cost us $14 million in canceled bookings and lost partnerships. We have a fiduciary duty to our shareholders." "To steal the company," Grace interrupted quietly. Every head turned toward her. "That's what you mean, isn't it, Walter? A fiduciary duty to help Victor Ramos and Silvercrest Investments strip my father's legacy for parts and sell the real estate to the highest bidder." The room went silent. Victor's expression hardened, but he said nothing. Walter's carefully constructed sympathy evaporated, replaced by something colder. "That's a serious accusation," Walter said. "And frankly, it sounds like exactly the kind of paranoid, emotional response that validates our concerns about your stability." Grace opened her briefcase with deliberate calm and withdrew a stack of documents thick enough to make several board members shift uncomfortably. "I have documentation of 32 years of racist policies and practices at the Newman Grand, all implemented or endorsed by Charles Ramos. I have 17 formal complaints filed with HR." She glanced at Margaret, who'd gone pale, all of which were marked, investigated, and resolved despite zero corrective action being taken. "I have financial records showing systematic devaluation of our flagship property through discriminatory practices that drove away customers and increased operational costs." She slid the first stack across the table. Robert Park, the general counsel, picked it up and began reading, his expression growing increasingly grim. "I also have," Grace continued, her voice steady as a scalpel, "evidence that Charles Ramos's assault on me was not a spontaneous act of anger, but rather the trigger event in a coordinated conspiracy to remove me from his company and facilitate its sale to Silvercrest Investments." Victor leaned forward, his voice tight. "This is absurd. You're grasping at straws to justify your violent outburst." "Violent outburst?" Grace's tone could have frozen nitrogen. "Is that what we're calling my response to being physically assaulted now?" She withdrew her laptop and turned it toward the board. "What you all saw was a carefully edited video designed to make me look unhinged. What you're about to see is the truth." Grace pressed play on Marcus's raw footage. The boardroom filled with the sound of Charles Ramos's voice, dripping with contempt and racial animus, escalating into physical violence. Several board members flinched at the moment of impact. Grace watched their faces, cataloging every reaction, every flash of discomfort or shame. But she didn't stop there. She let the footage play forward to the security office, to Victor Ramos and Charles discussing their media strategy, to Victor's explicit statement about the board saying what they'd been told to say. "The board's been saying what we've told them to say." Walter's face had drained of color. 2 board members were staring at Victor with open hostility. Margaret looked like she might be sick. Grace stopped the video and opened one of Hattie's notebooks, the pages marked with decades of documentation. Hattie Morrison worked at the Newman Grand for 32 years. She documented every discriminatory act, every racist policy, every complaint that was ignored. And she documented something else too, The board meetings were concerns about Charles Ramos were raised and dismissed. The financial reports that showed declining performance at the Newman Grand, while every other property thrived. The pattern of protection that allowed systemic abuse to flourish because it served a larger agenda. She looked directly at Victor. You needed the Newman Grand to fail. You needed me to look unstable. You needed a crisis that would give you the votes to remove me and sell this company. Charles wasn't just your nephew. He was your saboteur. And all of you, her gaze swept the table, either knew or should have known what was happening in our flagship property. James Chun, her CFO, spoke for the first time. I've reviewed the financial analysis Grace prepared. The correlation between Charles Ramos's policies and the property's decline is undeniable, and I've traced Meridian Capital's stock purchases. Victor, your hedge fund has been systematically acquiring shares through shell companies for 18 months, clearly in anticipation of a buyout scenario. Robert Park set down the documents he'd been reading, his expression grave. If even a quarter of what's documented here is accurate, this company faces massive legal liability. But more than that, he looked at Walter and Victor. If you've been coordinating to manipulate board decisions for personal financial gain, that's a clear breach of fiduciary duty, possibly criminal conspiracy. Walter stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This is a witch hunt. Grace is deflecting from her own misconduct by manufacturing conspiracy theory. The evidence isn't theoretical, Grace said, her voice cutting through his protest like a blade. It's documented, time-stamped, and admissible. Charles Ramos assaulted me. Victor Ramos orchestrated the cover-up and media campaign. And you, Walter, have been facilitating their access to this board and this company for your own profit. I'm invoking the moral turpitude clause in our corporate bylaws. Any board member found to have engaged in criminal conduct or gross ethical violations can have their voting rights suspended pending investigation. She stood, matching Walter's energy but surpassing it with cold authority. Victor Ramos, your voting rights are suspended. Walter Hartwick, your voting rights are suspended. Margaretchen, you're terminated effective immediately for falsifying HR investigations. And to everyone else at this table, you have a choice. Stand with the people who tried to steal this company, or stand with the woman who's been trying to save it. The silence that followed was absolute. Then Sarah Mitchell, one of the original investors and Grace's father's friend, raised her hand. I move that we table a resolution calling for Dr. Newman's resignation and instead open a formal investigation into the allegations she presented. Seconded. James Chin said immediately. The vote was 7-2, with Victor and Walter abstaining under protest. Grace gathered her materials, her hands steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. This meeting is adjourned. Legal will be in touch with anyone who needs clarification on their obligations going forward. And gentlemen, she looked at Victor and Walter, I'd recommend you retain counsel. You're going to need it. 3 weeks after the board meeting, Grace stood in the lobby of the Newman Grand and allowed herself to feel something she'd been rationing carefully. Satisfaction. The Italian marble gleamed under the chandeliers. The Art Deco fixtures sparkled with fresh polish, and the air hummed with the quiet efficiency of a hotel that finally understood its purpose. But it wasn't the physical transformation that moved her, it was the people. Hattie Morrison stood near the concierge desk in a tailored blazer, her new title embroidered on a name badge that read Director of Culture and Inclusion. She was training a group of new hires, her voice warm but firm as she walked them through the standards Grace had spent the past weeks codifying into policy. Every guest, every time, without exception, not just words on a wall anymore, but a mandate backed by accountability. The sound of footsteps drew Grace's attention to the entrance. 2 police officers walked through the gilded doors, their presence a sharp contrast to the luxury surrounding them. Between them, hands cupped behind his back, walked Charles Ramos. His tailored suit was wrinkled, his face pale and drawn. He'd been arrested at his family's estate that morning on charges of assault, evidence tampering, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Victor Ramos had been taken into custody simultaneously, along with Walter Hartwick. The photographs were already circulating online, a different kind of viral moment. Charles's eyes found Grace across the lobby, and for a moment, their gazes locked. She saw fear there and anger, but also something like comprehension. He'd underestimated her. They all had. Assumed that because she was a woman, because she was black, because she'd built her empire on principles of dignity and respect, that she would be soft when pushed. They'd mistaken Grace for weakness. She held his stare as the officers escorted him past. Her expression neutral, but her posture radiating the kind of authority that required no words. He'd raised his hand against her in this lobby. Now he was leaving it in handcuffs, his career destroyed, his family's reputation in ruins, and his freedom measured in years rather than decades. The symmetry was almost poetic. Marcus Obi emerged from the IT office, now wearing a badge that identified him as Assistant Director of Security Technology. He'd been promoted, granted immunity for his cooperation, and tasked with implementing new transparent security protocols. He gave Grace a small nod as Charles was led past, a gesture of solidarity between two people who both had to decide who they wanted to be when it mattered most. Grace's phone buzzed. A text from James Chun. Stock price up 12% since the press conference. 3 new partnership inquiries this morning. The market likes integrity. Who knew? She allowed herself a small smile. The press conference had been brutal. 90 minutes of explaining the conspiracy, showing the evidence, and facing questions from journalists who'd spent weeks painting her as an unhinged aggressor. But the truth, when presented with documentation and witnesses and the kind of meticulous preparation Grace had built her career on, had a way of cutting through narratives. The viral video had been replaced by the unedited footage. The hashtag #UnhingedEO had been overtaken by hashtag Justice for Grace and hashtag Hospitality with Dignity. Sarah Mitchell, now serving as interim board chair, entered through the main doors with a kind of purposeful stride that suggested she'd already had 3 meetings before 9 a.m. She'd spent the past week systematically restructuring the board, removing every member who'd shown even a hint of complicity with Victor's scheme. The new board was smaller, more diverse, and considerably more interested in the company's actual mission than in stripping it for profit. Grace. Sarah greeted her with a warm embrace. Ready for the reopening? Grace looked around the lobby, at Hattie training staff who'd been hired for their compassion rather than their connections, at Marcus ensuring that every camera angle would capture truth rather than distortion, at the doorman opening doors for every guest with equal warmth regardless of their skin color or perceived wealth. She thought of her father, who built the first Newman Hotel with nothing but a dream and a conviction that everyone deserved to be treated with dignity. She thought of the empire she'd nearly lost defending those same principles. "I've been ready," Grace said. The reopening ceremony was intimate by design. No grand spectacle, no celebrity guests, just the people who'd fought to make this moment possible. Grace stood at a podium in the lobby, facing a small crowd of employees, community members, and journalists who'd earned their invitation through honest reporting. 30 years ago, my father opened the Newman Grand with promise. Grace began, her voice steady and clear. He promised that every person who walked through these doors would be treated as someone who mattered, not because of their wealth, their status, or the color of their skin, but because they were human beings deserving of respect. For a while, we lost sight of that promise. We allowed systems and people who value profit over principles to corrode the foundation he built. She paused, her eyes finding Hattie in the crowd. But the beautiful thing about foundations is that they're still there, even when they're buried. Hattie Morrison spent 32 years documenting every crack, every compromise, every moment when we failed to live up to our values. She kept the receipts, literally, because she believed that someday someone would care enough to rebuild properly. Today, we honor that faith. Grace unveiled a plaque that would be mounted in the lobby, engraved with simple words. In recognition of Hattie Morrison and all those who stood witness, your courage made justice possible. The applause was genuine, scattered with tears from staff members who'd lived through the old regime and couldn't quite believe the new one. Hattie approached the podium, her small frame somehow filling the space with dignity that had nothing to do with physical stature. "Dr. Newman asked me what I want people to understand about the Newman Grand going forward," Hattie said, her voice soft but carrying perfectly in the acoustically designed space. "I want them to know that luxury isn't about marble floors and crystal chandeliers. It's about making every human being feel like they're worth something. That's the real hospitality. And that's what we're building here. As the ceremony concluded and guests began to filter through the lobby, actual guests now, checking in for the soft reopening, Grace stood near the windows watching the city pulse with afternoon energy. Her phone buzzed with messages. Congratulations from industry colleagues, interview requests from business publications, and a text from her attorney confirming that Charles's trial date had been set for January. But the message that made her pause came from an unknown number. Dr. Newman, this is Jennifer Halstead. I was the front desk clerk you terminated. I've spent the past 3 weeks in therapy, confronting some hard truths about who I've become and why. I don't expect forgiveness or my job back. I just wanted you to know that what you did, standing up when it cost you everything, it woke something up in people like me who've been sleepwalking through complicity. Thank you for that. I'm trying to do better. Grace read the message twice, then forwarded it to Hattie with a simple note. Proof that people can change if they're willing to do the work. Thoughts on a redemption pathway program. Hattie's response came within seconds. Let's talk tomorrow. But yes, grace without accountability is just permission. Grace with accountability is transformation. As the sun set over the city, casting the Newman Grand's facade in gold, Grace walked through the lobby one final time before heading home. She stopped at the mission statement. Those words her father had written, that she defended, that had nearly cost her everything, every guest, every time, without exception. Simple words, revolutionary practice, and finally, a promise this building could keep. She thought of Charles in a cell, of Victor facing federal prosecutors, of Walter's political connections proving worthless against documentation and truth. She thought of the board seat that now belonged to a civil rights attorney instead of a hedge fund vulture. She thought of Marcus, who'd risked everything to bring her the truth, and Hattie, who'd spent 3 decades bearing witness in the hopes that witness would someday matter. Justice, Grace had learned, wasn't a moment. It was a process, messy and imperfect and requiring constant vigilance. But it was also possible. That was a lesson she'd carry forward, the one she'd teach to every employee, every guest, every person who walked through these doors. You could build something beautiful. You could watch it corrode. And if you were willing to fight for it, really fight, with evidence and courage and an unwillingness to accept that power always wins, you could reclaim it. Grace turned off the lobby lights, leaving only the security fixtures glowing softly in the darkness. Tomorrow, the Newman Grand would open its doors to the public again. Tomorrow, the real work of transformation would continue. But tonight, standing in the lobby where she'd been assaulted and humiliated and ultimately vindicated, Dr. Grace Newman allowed herself something she rarely indulged, pride. Not in her wealth or her title or her empire. Pride in refusing to let them make her small. Pride in building something worth fighting for. Pride in remembering, even when it cost everything, who she was and what she stood for. The marble floors gleamed in the dim light, patient and enduring, ready for whatever came next. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned to Echoverse as we bring you more incredible stories. Kindly ensure to like and subscribe if you haven't.